At Meridian Airlines, Lucas Daniels, a skilled and highly trained black pilot, has always been dedicated to his job, flying planes with precision and professionalism. However, despite his impressive track record and years of experience, he finds himself subjected to subtle yet persistent racism in the workplace. The tension in the air is palpable every time he walks into the cockpit or the break room. His white colleagues, though friendly on the surface, never truly accept him as one of their own. Their patronizing smiles, condescending comments, and exclusion from key discussions are daily reminders of the prejudice that lurks just beneath the surface. Lucas's abilities have never been questioned by the passengers who rely on his expertise, nor by the flying hours he's logged in his career. Yet, within the walls of Meridian Airlines, his competence is continuously undermined. Despite outperforming many of his colleagues, Lucas is repeatedly overlooked for promotion opportunities, with leadership positions almost exclusively going to white pilots, even when they lack the same qualifications or experience. His frustration builds with each unjust decision, yet the weight of systemic racism makes it difficult to voice his concerns. In meetings, Lucas notices how his ideas are often dismissed without consideration, while similar suggestions from white colleagues are met with enthusiasm. He knows his skills should speak for themselves, but the color of his skin seems to overshadow his qualifications. Over time, this slow erosion of his confidence turns into bitterness. He begins questioning whether his hard work and loyalty to the company will ever be enough. The isolation he feels is suffocating. He is constantly surrounded by colleagues, yet emotionally, he is alone in his struggle. One day, after being passed over for another promotion, Lucas reaches a breaking point. He stares at his reflection in the airport lounge's glass window, his mind swirling with frustration. He thinks back on all the instances where his abilities were dismissed, all the times he had to bite his tongue in the face of racism. His hands clench in anger, but the reality of his situation weighs heavily on him. What could he do in an environment that is blind to its own prejudices? The management at Meridian Airlines seems blind to the issue. When Lucas raises his concerns in private conversations with higher-ups, they dismiss them with empty reassurances. The company prides itself on being progressive, but its actions tell a different story. The corporate culture remains rooted in outdated and discriminatory norms, creating a toxic environment where diversity is celebrated only in superficial ways. As Lucas's frustration grows, so does the tension in his relationships with his colleagues. Some of them, though well-meaning, remain uncomfortable in his presence, unsure of how to approach the topic of race. The few who might understand are too afraid to speak out, fearing retaliation or being labeled as troublemakers. Lucas feels increasingly isolated, his every day a battle between his dedication to his job and his growing disillusionment with the system that refuses to see him for his true worth. Despite all of this, Lucas is not ready to give up. Deep down, he knows that his fight is not just for himself, but for the future of all those who come after him. He is determined to continue proving his worth, even if it means enduring the daily injustices that come with working in a place that has yet to understand the full importance of diversity and inclusion. But every day becomes more of a struggle, as the burden of being overlooked, disregarded, and mistreated weighs heavier on his shoulders. Lucas's journey is one of resilience, but it is also a reflection of the systemic barriers that continue to exist within many industries, despite the facade of progress. Lucas Daniels had worked tirelessly for this day. After years of rigorous training, countless hours in the cockpit, and overcoming every obstacle, he had earned the prestigious title of captain at Meridian Airlines. The dream that had been cultivated since his early days in aviation had finally come to fruition. But as the sun began to rise on his first day, there was an unsettling feeling in his chest that wouldn't go away. This should have been a moment of pure joy and triumph, but deep down, Lucas knew things weren't going to be as simple as they appeared. When he arrived at the airport, the bustling terminal was filled with passengers going about their day, unaware of the internal struggle that Lucas was experiencing. The familiar hum of the airport, the click of luggage wheels, and the chatter of travelers should have put him at ease, but instead, they only added to his anxiety. Lucas had worked so hard to get here, but now that he was finally in the cockpit, everything felt different. This moment, which was supposed to be a monumental achievement, was tainted by something more insidious, something he couldn't quite put into words. As he walked into the cockpit, his co-pilot, Daniel, offered a polite but curt nod. Daniel was an experienced first officer, one who had flown with the airline for years, and yet, there was a coldness in his demeanor. His handshake was firm but brief, and his eyes never met Lucas's for long. Lucas could sense that Daniel wasn't welcoming him as a colleague, but rather tolerating him as a necessity. This was supposed to be a moment of camaraderie, of mutual respect between two pilots in charge of the same flight, but instead, there was an invisible wall between them, one that Lucas could not breach no matter how hard he tried. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. They had already completed the pre-flight checklist, and Lucas was taking the lead, as he was trained to do. But Daniel lingered over every decision, every action, offering unsolicited advice, his voice laced with a subtle undertone of doubt. Lucas's fingers tightened on the controls as he double-checked every instrument, but it was difficult to ignore the quiet skepticism in Daniel's voice, especially when it seemed that every move Lucas made was scrutinized with a sharpness that didn't belong. Lucas knew his job. He had earned the right to be there. But in that moment, it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, like his every action was being judged. When they started the engines and began taxiing toward the runway, Lucas's heart raced, but it wasn't from excitement. The familiar hum of the engine should have been a comforting sound, something that signified his authority and control, but all he could hear was the silence from Daniel beside him. Even though they were both professionals, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something was wrong. And then it happened. The flight attendants came in for their briefing, and Lucas could see their discomfort. They were polite, of course, but their eyes betrayed them. They exchanged uneasy glances when they realized that the captain was a black man. Their smiles were forced, and there was a subtle hesitation in their voices when they addressed him, as if they were trying to reassure themselves that they were following protocol. To them, this was the first time they had seen a black man in the captain's seat, and Lucas could feel the weight of their unspoken judgment, their reluctance to accept him in this role. He could sense that they were expecting him to falter, to make mistakes. It was as if his presence alone was an anomaly that they hadn't prepared for. But Lucas pushed the feelings of frustration aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. He knew that if he let this affect him, it would be harder to prove his worth. And so, he carried on, checking the flight path, reviewing weather conditions, and making sure that everything was in order, all the while suppressing the feeling that he was being watched more closely than any other pilot in the room. The flight was smooth, but the atmosphere in the cockpit was anything but. Daniel continued to offer advice, and though Lucas appreciated the help, there was an edge to his words that felt condescending. It was as if Daniel felt that Lucas couldn't handle the responsibility of being in charge, even though Lucas had been more than qualified for this position for years. Every time he made a decision, every time he adjusted the flight path, Daniel seemed ready to jump in and suggest something different, often with a tone of superiority that made Lucas's blood boil. The longer the flight went on, the more Lucas's frustration grew. The air felt thick with tension, and his every move felt scrutinized, even though everything he did was in line with protocol. He had trained for years to be here, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was a black man, and in some eyes, that made him unworthy of the title of captain. It wasn't about his skills, his qualifications, or his dedication, it was about the color of his skin. He was constantly aware of the fact that people were watching him, judging him, waiting for him to slip up so they could confirm their biases. As the flight came to an end and the plane began its descent, Lucas's mind raced. He was exhausted, not from the work, but from the emotional toll of constantly having to prove himself. He had earned his place at the front of the plane, but there were still people who saw him as an outsider. The landing was smooth, but even as the wheels touched down on the runway, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the day was far from over. When the plane taxied to the gate and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Lucas finally exhaled, the weight of the day lifting ever so slightly. He had done his job. He had kept the plane safe and brought it in for a smooth landing, but the reality was that none of that mattered to the passengers or the crew who had looked at him with doubt throughout the flight. The congratulations he received felt hollow, like they were given out of obligation rather than genuine respect. Walking off the plane that day, Lucas was both relieved and angry. He had made it through his first day as captain, but the experience had been a stark reminder of the world he was living in. It wasn't just about being a pilot anymore, it was about fighting for recognition, fighting to prove that he was worthy of the same respect as his colleagues. He had earned a seat at the front of the plane, but for many, that was something they were still unwilling to accept. That night, lying in bed, Lucas reflected on the day. He knew that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges and moments of doubt, but he was determined to continue pushing forward. He had to prove that he belonged, not just to the airline, but to himself. The prejudice he faced on his first day was a harsh reminder of the road that lay ahead, but it was also the fuel he needed to keep fighting for a world where someone like him didn't have to constantly prove his worth. Lucas Daniels stood alone on the tarmac, the cold wind biting at his face as the last of the passengers disembarked from the aircraft. The thrill of flying, the power of commanding a plane, had faded into the background. All he could feel was the weight of everything he had encountered that day. His first flight as captain had been filled with the usual excitement, but there was something different about this one. It wasn't the technical challenges of flying the plane, nor the pressure of being in charge. No, the hardest part had been something far more insidious, the subtle and not-so-subtle racism that permeated the environment. Lucas had always known that being a black pilot in an industry dominated by white men would come with its challenges, but nothing had prepared him for the relentless, oppressive atmosphere at Meridian Airlines. From the moment he boarded the plane, he could feel the tension in the air, the slight hesitations in his colleagues' voices, the dismissive glances that lingered just a little too long. The flight attendants, though polite, had been stiff and distant, avoiding eye contact as if unsure how to act in his presence. His co-pilot, Daniel, had been the worst. Lucas could feel the condescension dripping from every word Daniel spoke, the barely veiled judgment in his tone as if questioning Lucas's competence. But Lucas wasn't new to this. He had spent years working his way up, proving his skills and capabilities. He had faced discrimination before, but he had learned to rise above it. He had learned to hide the sting of the barbed comments and sideways glances. But today, it felt different. Today, he had been in control, commanding the aircraft, ensuring that everything ran smoothly, and still, his authority was questioned. As the last of the passengers filed off the plane, Lucas's mind raced. The sense of unease had settled deep in his chest, gnawing at him like a slow burn. He had done everything right, and yet, there was a nagging feeling, a suspicion that something more was going on beneath the surface. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being held to a different standard than his colleagues, more than just his performance, more than his decisions. It was as if his mere presence was an obstacle to some. Lucas paused before heading back to the crew room, feeling the weight of the day pressing on him. His first instinct was to shake it off, to tell himself it was just a rough day. But deep down, he knew better. He had worked too hard, fought too long for this moment to let it slip away because of some vague discomfort. Something was wrong. And he wasn't about to ignore it. As he made his way through the airport, Lucas's mind began to unravel the web of subtle and not-so-subtle interactions that had occurred over the course of the flight. It was the way the crew's faces shifted when they realized he was the captain. It was the constant second-guessing of his decisions, the raised eyebrows whenever he issued a command. It was the small, almost imperceptible comments from passengers who seemed startled to see a black man in the cockpit. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being scrutinized more than anyone else. His every action was being watched, evaluated, and critiqued, even when nothing was wrong. But there was no way to prove it, no tangible evidence that would be enough to convince anyone that something insidious was happening. Still, Lucas was determined to find answers. The system that had shaped his career, the one that he had worked tirelessly to fit into, was no longer an abstract entity. It had become personal. The tension inside Lucas's chest grew as he made his way back to the crew room. The sense of frustration was palpable. He had already begun to feel the familiar pangs of exhaustion setting in, but this time, it wasn't just physical fatigue. It was a deep, emotional exhaustion that seemed to seep into every part of his being. It was the weight of being constantly watched, constantly judged, and constantly reminded that no matter how good he was, there would always be someone who thought he didn't belong. But Lucas wasn't one to back down. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about his personal experience. This was bigger than him. It wasn't just about his journey as a pilot, it was about the system itself. The way it perpetuated bias, discrimination, and inequality. And Lucas knew, deep in his bones, that if he didn't take action now, nothing would change. Not for him, and not for the others who had come before him, nor for the pilots who would follow in his footsteps. The days that followed were filled with mounting tension as Lucas began to investigate the undercurrents of discrimination he had felt on that first flight. He started by analyzing his own flight logs, carefully reviewing the assignments he had been given, the routes he was flying, and how his performance had been scrutinized compared to his colleagues. His findings confirmed what he had already suspected. There were patterns that told him that, without a doubt, he was being held to a higher standard than others. The more he dug, the more the reality of what he was facing became clear. The subtle jabs, the sarcastic comments, the questioning of his decisions, it was all part of a bigger picture. His white colleagues were treated with an ease and trust that he could never seem to earn. While they flew the same routes, made the same decisions, and dealt with the same challenges, it was Lucas's every move that seemed to be under constant scrutiny. He was beginning to see just how deeply ingrained the biases were in the system. Lucas spoke to other pilots, especially the older, more experienced ones who had been at Meridian Airlines for years. One veteran pilot, James, a seasoned captain who had witnessed everything, told him quietly, "It's not just you. It's always been this way. They'll pretend like they're all for equality, but when it comes down to it, they'll always put you under the microscope." The words hit Lucas hard, but they also solidified his resolve. It wasn't just him. It wasn't just his imagination. The system at Meridian Airlines was built on a foundation of biases, and those biases were so deeply woven into its fabric that they were almost invisible to anyone not directly affected by them. But Lucas could see them now, could feel them in every glance, in every whispered conversation. And he wasn't going to let it slide. The investigation became his obsession. He compiled data, cross-referenced flight assignments, and gathered testimonies from other pilots who had endured similar treatment. Each piece of evidence, no matter how small, added to the growing picture of a system designed to uphold inequality. But the deeper he went, the more dangerous his quest became. His colleagues began to notice his questions, the way he started paying closer attention to the decisions being made, the patterns emerging from the way they were assigned tasks. The tension grew unbearable as Lucas felt the weight of the system closing in around him. He could feel the pressure mounting, the hostility in the air thickening with every conversation. The more he uncovered, the more opposition he faced. The airline wasn't going to let him expose the truth without a fight. But Lucas wasn't about to back down. The stakes were higher now, not just for him, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. With every confrontation, with every piece of evidence, the tension between Lucas and the system escalated. He had become a threat, and he knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. But his resolve was stronger than ever. He wasn't just trying to expose the truth for himself, he was doing it for every black pilot who had come before him, and for everyone who would follow in his footsteps. The path ahead was uncertain, and the dangers were real, but Lucas knew that he had no choice. If he didn't fight, no one else would. And so, as the days wore on, the tension only grew. But Lucas was ready. He would take on the system, no matter the cost. Lucas Daniels stared at the cluttered desk before him, the papers scattered across it feeling almost suffocating. The sound of his breath seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness of the room. His fingers hovered over the documents, the weight of the decision pressing down on him with each passing second. There was no denying it any longer, everything he had suspected about Meridian Airlines, everything he had feared, was real. The system was broken, and it was far more corrupt than he had ever imagined. He had to expose it. Lucas had never been one to shy away from a challenge. As the first black pilot to ever become a captain at the airline, He had spent years battling prejudice and self-doubt, constantly having to prove himself in an industry that wasn't particularly kind to people like him. But this was different. What he had uncovered was not just about race or inequality, it was about a culture of greed, deception, and systemic abuse that had been festering at the very core of the company for years. The evidence was overwhelming. Lucas had painstakingly pieced together flight logs, emails, and internal documents that exposed the disturbing truth. Flight routes had been deliberately altered, not for safety or necessity, but for personal profit. Pilots had been assigned dangerous or unprofitable flights while the company's chosen few took the most lucrative routes. The higher-ups had manipulated the schedules to ensure certain individuals, those with connections, those with the right skin color, were always at the top, always benefiting at the expense of the others. It was this last realization that had truly shaken Lucas to his core. He had long suspected that something was wrong, that the system was rigged in favor of the more privileged pilots, but seeing it laid out so clearly in front of him was something else entirely. He had been subjected to the same treatment for years, forced to work longer shifts, to take more dangerous flights, to put in more hours while others who were less qualified seemed to get special treatment. And he wasn't the only one. He had spoken to other pilots, his colleagues who had quietly whispered their frustrations, their own suspicions about the airline's operations. They all felt the same way. But no one had dared to speak out. Until now. Lucas's heart raced as he carefully sifted through the evidence. His mind flashed back to the conversations he had had over the past few weeks. The whispers from the pilots in the break room, the hushed voices in the locker rooms, the subtle looks exchanged behind closed doors. He had gathered their stories, their grievances, their fears. He had asked questions, dug deeper, and uncovered a tangled web of corruption that reached from the flight deck all the way to the highest offices of the airline. The more Lucas uncovered, the more his anger grew. How could they do this? How could they ruin lives for the sake of their own profit and power? He had worked so hard to get where he was, to earn the respect of his colleagues, to prove himself as a capable and dedicated pilot. And yet, he was constantly being held back, forced to compete with a system designed to keep him and others like him in their place. It wasn't just a personal affront, it was an affront to everyone who had ever worked hard, who had ever dreamed of rising above their circumstances, only to have the system crush them underfoot. The thought of bringing all of this to light terrified him. The people involved were powerful, influential, and ruthless. He knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. Lucas could already feel the weight of the consequences settling in on his shoulders. If he exposed the corruption, there would be no turning back. He would become a target, an enemy in the eyes of the very people who controlled the airline. His career could be over before it ever really began. He could be blacklisted, his reputation destroyed, his future in aviation dashed. And yet, the thought of staying silent, of letting this injustice continue unchecked, was even worse. He sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he stared at the report in front of him. This was it. The moment he had been dreading and anticipating all at once. He had collected enough evidence, interviewed enough people, and now it was time to make the call. But even as he prepared to expose the truth, doubt gnawed at him. What if they came after him? What if they ruined him? The higher-ups at the airline had a history of silencing anyone who dared to rock the boat. He had seen it happen before, had heard the stories of other employees who had spoken up and been crushed under the weight of the system. But Lucas couldn't turn back now. He had come this far, and there was no way he could live with himself if he didn't act. The truth had to be known. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every pilot, every flight attendant, every crew member who had been treated unfairly, who had been made to suffer for the sake of those in power. They all deserved better. They deserved justice. With a deep breath, Lucas clicked send. The email containing all of his findings, the evidence he had so carefully gathered, was now in the hands of the authorities, journalists, government officials, labor unions, anyone who could help expose the truth. He had done it. He had taken the first step toward bringing the corruption to light, toward tearing down the system that had kept so many people trapped. As the report was sent, Lucas couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The weight that had been crushing him for weeks, for months, was finally lifted. But that relief was short-lived. He knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The powers that be would fight back. They would try to discredit him, to smear his name, to destroy his career. But Lucas was ready. He had faced worse before. He had fought against prejudice, against doubt, against every obstacle that had been placed in his path. This was no different. The fight for justice wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Lucas took a deep breath and stood up from his desk. He wasn't alone in this. He knew there were others who felt just as he did, who wanted to see the system change. Together, they would make sure that the truth would prevail. No matter what it cost him. Meridian Airlines had once soared above the clouds, a beacon of luxury and impeccable service. But now, it was nothing more than a shadow of its former self, crumbling under the weight of scandal, corruption, and unrelenting truth. The news of the airline's collapse sent ripples across the aviation industry. For Lucas Daniels, the black pilot who had long suffered at the hands of Meridian's toxic culture, this was a bittersweet moment. The downfall of Meridian was not just the end of an airline, it was the closing of a chapter in his life and the beginning of something far bigger, something that could change the industry forever. As the wreckage of Meridian Airlines fell apart, Lucas wandered through the now silent corridors of the company's once grand headquarters. The bright, gleaming walls that once housed board meetings and promises of progress now seemed cold and empty, just like the company's values had become. He walked through the lobby, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. This building had witnessed so many decisions that had, at the time, seemed so important. Yet, here he stood, one of the few remaining souls, carrying the knowledge that those decisions had led to its destruction. He remembered his first day at Meridian, a time when he had been filled with dreams of flying, of proving himself as a skilled pilot. But the reality had been different. It wasn't just the long hours, the grueling schedules, or the endless paperwork. It was the quiet racism, the microaggressions, and the subtle, but ever-present, discrimination that ate away at his confidence every single day. The whispers from colleagues who doubted his abilities simply because of the color of his skin. The constant battle to be seen as more than just a token black pilot. It had worn him down over the years, but what hurt most was how powerless he felt to change things. That all changed when Lucas, against all odds, began to investigate deeper into the airline's culture. The systemic issues were far more entrenched than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just a few rogue employees with outdated beliefs, it was built into the very fabric of the company. The policies, the practices, the leadership, it all supported an unspoken but glaring racism. He had felt the shift in the atmosphere when he raised his concerns. People began to distance themselves, whispering behind his back, warning him to tread carefully. But Lucas couldn't ignore it anymore. He had a responsibility to uncover the truth, even if it meant losing everything. As the investigation grew, so did the danger. The higher-ups at Meridian began to feel the pressure, and their tactics turned ruthless. They tried to silence him, intimidate him, but Lucas refused to back down. He knew what was at stake. This wasn't just his career, it was the future of countless others who would suffer in silence, just as he had. The weight of their indifference was staggering, but Lucas didn't let it break him. He pressed on, fueled by the memories of the many people whose voices had been muted by a system that cared only about profit and status. The day the investigation was exposed to the public, it felt as though the air had been sucked out of his lungs. The headlines screamed betrayal. The media stormed the gates, reporters clamoring for any shred of information. The public was shocked, stunned by the scale of the deception. It wasn't just a few minor infractions, it was years of abuse, systemic inequality, and corruption. Meridian Airlines, once a towering figure in the aviation industry, was now the symbol of everything that had gone wrong with corporate America. And Lucas? He was both a hero and a pariah. Some celebrated him as a champion of justice, while others saw him as a traitor, a man who had destroyed a company that had provided so many jobs. But Lucas didn't care. He had no illusions about what the truth would cost him. Walking away from Meridian's ruins felt like stepping into the unknown. The company was bankrupt, its leadership gone, and its legacy tarnished forever. But amidst the wreckage, there was something else, something Lucas hadn't expected, a sense of opportunity. This wasn't just the end of one chapter. It was the beginning of a new story, one that Lucas had the power to shape. The collapse of Meridian created a void, one that demanded new leadership, new ideas, and a new direction. Lucas knew that this moment, as painful as it was, presented a chance to redefine the aviation industry. He couldn't let this opportunity slip through his fingers. It was time to rebuild. But this time, it would be different. Lucas was determined to create something that was based on integrity, transparency, and respect for every individual, no matter their race, gender, or background. He reached out to former colleagues, those who had seen the cracks in the system long before the public had. Together, they began to forge a new path forward, one that would be built on a foundation of fairness. They envisioned an airline where employees were valued, where passengers felt like they mattered, and where integrity was never compromised. It was a dream that seemed almost impossible in the wake of Meridian's downfall, but Lucas was undeterred. He had seen firsthand the power of truth, and he knew that there was no turning back. As the new airline began to take shape, there were moments of doubt. The challenges were immense: funding, the skepticism of investors, and the shadow of Meridian's failure that loomed over them. But with each setback, Lucas found new resolve. He couldn't let the mistakes of the past dictate the future. He had been through too much to give up now. His team, a diverse group of passionate individuals, shared his vision, and together, they kept pushing forward. Lucas often found himself reflecting on the lessons learned from Meridian's rise and fall. The most important lesson was that leadership meant taking responsibility, even when the system was broken. It meant standing firm in the face of adversity, even when the world seemed to be against you. And it meant never losing sight of the values that mattered most. Years later, when people looked back at the story of the new airline, they would remember the struggles, the sacrifices, and the triumphs. But more importantly, they would remember the legacy of change that Lucas had helped create. This wasn't just about building a successful business, it was about building a new world where fairness, equality, and respect were the cornerstones of success. The airline may have been born from the ashes of Meridian Airlines, but it was destined to fly higher, to create something that would outlast any corporate scandal. Lucas knew the road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and moments of doubt. But he was ready. He had fought for justice, and now, he was ready to lead by example. This was his moment to leave a lasting legacy, one that would inspire future generations to always stand for what is right, no matter the cost. The fall of Meridian Airlines had been the catalyst, but the future, his future, was now in his hands. And it was going to be brighter than ever before.